Thank you, Chloe. And thanks everybody for coming in person. It's great to be with you again. Last year, Chloe invited me to give a talk that some of you might have seen, but it was by Zoom. And it's never, you never have that proximity. So it's great to have people here and have people in the audience online as well. I noticed that we have people online from quite far away, including Chalet Cochand, who is dialing in all the way from Mexico. And I had the pleasure of speaking with Heidi in preparation for today's presentation. So shout out to Heidi. Today, we're going to talk about Heidi's family and legacy. But I think a lot of us know the history of Chalet Cochand. A lot of us would have skied there back in the day, Laurie and others. And we know the stories of Emile and Louis quite well. They've been, inducted into the Ski Hall of Fame, etc. But there are a lot of people behind the scenes, and I'm very interested in those stories. I like to hear what people experienced. And so I've interviewed people who worked there at the time and will be presenting their stories as well. So very brief introduction with Emile and Louis to give a bit of context for anybody who might not know, but we're also going to talk about other people who really contributed to the success of Chalet Cochand, going all the way from their spouses. So Léa Cochand, who was Emile's wife, Morna McLean, who was Louis' wife, all the way to the people from Sainte-Marguerite du Lac-Nasson, who were instrumental, according to Heidi Cochand, I think she's right, instrumental in the success of Chalet Cochand. So we'll be talking about all those people and other names that will be familiar to you. Let's see if this switches. Chloe, I'm not getting a switch. Page 2. There we go. Okay, how did you do with this mouse? Yeah. Right click? Okay, okay, so as I said last year, the presentation was really about all the ski resorts in the Laurentians and the kind of movers and shakers. I'm a PR consultant, so I was really interested in what I call marketing the Laurentians. So how it was that all of these mostly men would have created the ski resort legacy that we now know the Laurentians for. So, I presented people like Lauren McGibbon, and I presented George Wheeler and Vernon Cardy and Rattel and Joe Ryan from Tremblant. These were all movers and shakers. And my personal favorites, which are the Cochand. And the reason that they're near and dear to my heart is that I actually own my home is on the land where Chalet Cochand stood. So I own 8 acres, including the land where the hotel was before it was demolished, and then all the way down to the lake. So it's part of the reason I bought the place. It's quite small. You'll see a bit of some photos, but it was the honeymoon suite. So it's a very small home. It wasn't at all what I had in mind when I was shopping for a house in the Laurentians. But the real estate agent was very savvy, and she put the home's history, which piqued my interest as a student of history, as a historian by training, and so that kind of sealed the deal for me. I was the perfect client for that property, I think. Okay, let's see if I can get this going. I'm going the wrong way. No, go away. Sorry. Okay, so you're just shifting it, right? Mm-hmm. Going like this?
No, I'm moving up. Just up with 2 fingers.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I can use this because otherwise we just keep going. Yeah,
good dog has to be on it. Or you can just ask me. I can switch.
Can you do it for me?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so my trusty assistant, Louis, will help make this much smoother. A bit more about myself. Before I became a PR consultant, I was a master's student in history at UQAM, doing work in women's history. And I decided McGill had, it was last year that McGill was offering their teaching diploma, a one-year teaching diploma. And I come from a family of teachers. And I thought, oh, that's quite a practical diploma to get. And I had visions of traveling the world, and it'd be great to have this diploma. So I got my teaching certificate, and I did teach for a year and a bit. I taught at Trafalgar School for Girls in Montreal. Great experience. Made me realize I didn't have the vocation. I loved it. I had lots of fun, maybe too much fun, according to the headmaster. But one of the things, because I was really interested in women's history, one of the things that I did for open house, young children, your school will do an open house. And we had to come up with, we were encouraged to come up with some creative ideas. It was the beginning of the year. What I decided to do was have my students do a work based on the work of artist Judy Chicago. Okay, her work is kind of seminal. It's the dinner party, and what she did is she made these kinds of ceramic plates and place settings based on female historical figures. So you had like Cleopatra, and you had, I don't know, Anne of Cleves, and you had all of these really well-known historical figures. When my students did this exercise, they were invited to pick their own historical figure, which they did. And some chose Cleopatra, some chose Anne of Cleves, Queen Elizabeth. One group did something which I thought was really interesting. They chose themselves. Okay, so they did their place setting based on their own personal story. And so I set out my classroom much like this work, in the triangular shape with all the students' work around the table. And it was open house night, and parents came in. And I was explaining the concept of what I was doing. And one father got very red in the face. He was really, really angry. And he said, "What is this? I don't understand." And he was standing in front of the place setting of the two girls. And he says, "They've just done their own story. This isn't history. This isn't Cleopatra. This isn't Queen Elizabeth. What is this? This is garbage." And he was quite upset. And I said, actually, I was really, really happy when I saw that happen, because it told me that the girls understood that they're actors in history as well, and that the story of ordinary people is very important and needs to be documented. So that's always been, no, he wasn't happy with that answer. I don't know if he enrolled his child in the school, but for me, that was a great sign, because history isn't just about the big names. It's not just about the Emile and the Louis Cochand. It's about all the people that contributed to the success of, in this case, Chalet Cochand. So that's why, if you go to the next slide, I've made the parallel. Some of you might remember the British series Upstairs, Downstairs. I think it aired in the 60s, maybe. And the more modern equivalent, which would be Downton Abbey, which does a really good job of this. So it tells the story of the upper class. It tells the story of the lord of the manor and the lady of the manor. Those are the stories we used to, before the 60s, those were the stories that we heard. And then in the 60s, social history came in, and we started to really, scholars started to really get interested in the history of common man. And so Downton Abbey, Upstairs, Downstairs will also tell the story of the downstairs. And that's what I'd like to do a bit more of today. Just again, to give you context, like I said, I'm a PR consultant. A lot of the work I do is on social acceptability. So I'll work with cities, or I'll work with developers who have projects and that want to explain their projects to people, okay? Just to give you an example, one of the projects that I worked on, one of my clients that I worked on, was the Lac Tremblant Beach, the beach and tennis club. The kind of new owners of that are my clients, and we did work on a project to kind of launch this as a new venture. So that's the work that I do professionally. But I've always been historian in my heart. And so as I get a bit older, as I start to transition and think about what I'd like to do in the next 10, 20 years, one of the projects I have in mind is this telling of stories. So telling the stories of families, telling the stories of family businesses. And the project that I have that is kind of an introduction to this concept is He Said, She Said stories. So if you go on the website, you'll see a bit of the concept, but the idea is to do a very simple story around one event, like a couple's wedding day, and have each member of the couple, the man and the woman, or the woman and the woman, or whatever, tell their side of the story and bring those perspectives together. This is what I'm interested in doing. The pandemic kind of put a break on that because I wasn't able to meet with clients in person, and I really do want to do that work face to face. So we'll see where the next period goes, but that's something that I'd like to do moving forward. So this brings us to today's talk. And thank you again to Chloe and to Four Corners for this invitation. A lot of you will have great memories of Chalet Cochand. I have people who stop at least once or twice a year. I have people who stop, who come onto the land, who knock on the door, who say, "Where's the hotel? What happened to it?" Who have really, really great memories. Every time I talk to somebody about Chalet Cochand, their face lights up. Like it's obviously great memories. Over the past few years, I've been there about 8 years now. Over the past 5 years, I've really started to interview people about their time. And now I've interviewed people from as far away as New Zealand, people who are in England, who came over to work at Chalet Cochand. And I've also interviewed people who are much more local, who have memories of their time there as well. So just a quick timeline. Emile Cochand comes over from Switzerland. He was a really high performing athlete. He was a very well-known skier in Switzerland. It wasn't the family business. The family wasn't necessarily on board with this, but this was really his passion. And so he came to Canada for this purpose. And he worked at the Sainte-Adèle hotel in Sainte-Adèle as their ski instructor. And that's where he kind of got his start. I'll talk about Leah and how things came together for them in a minute. But Chalet Cochand, its first incarnation was in 1914. So what they did is they bought existing land and existing farmhouse, and they started to open up 2-3 bedrooms, and slowly the reputation built from there. There was an original building that burnt. Unfortunately, one of the workers pulled, cleaning one of the rooms, he pulled a straw mattress a bit too close to the fire. And imagine, back then there would have been no electricity, nothing, and the hotel burned. And so they had to rebuild. So you can imagine that for a couple back then, it would have been a very, very hard life, clearing the ski trails, etc. And we'll talk about all the people who kind of helped make that happen. So Emile Cochand was the first owner of Chalet Cochand. He ran it with his wife Leah until just after the Second World War. After the war, he decided to retire, and he passed the hotel, or sold the hotel and the ski slopes to another land, to mainly 2 of his sons, Louis, who took over the hotel, and Emile, who took some land, but also the ski hills across the lake. So if you know Chalet Cochand and you have Pierre Pelado, which separates the land, you had the hotel on one side with some hills behind, but the main ski hills were the ones on the other side of the lake, and they're the ones that Emile took over. Louis ran Chalet Cochand for about 20 or so years, until in 1966 it passed out of the family's ownership. They had financial problems, and it was sold off to other owners. And there were a series of owners after that. Probably the best known was who was affiliated with the University of Montreal, kind of phys ed guru, and he ran a camp there. So now there are 60 and 70-year-olds who remember being camp counselors at that location. And one of my former colleagues as a child actually stayed in my cottage, because my cottage is cottage number 2, and he remembers staying there. So that closed in the 80s. A bunch of resorts closed at that time. The building stayed vacant And the municipality started to get a bit nervous because young people would go and squat and party in the hotel, and they were worried that there would be fire, so they ordered it demolished. It was demolished in 1988, much to the chagrin of a lot of people who now, 30 years later, show up and see that the hotel's no longer there. So that's kind of the transition between the two. Here on the slide, in the little cameo, you have Emile with Louis, who would later take over the running of the management of the hotel and the ownership of the hotel. Joe Graham has a historian who's online right now, has written quite extensively, obviously, about the history of Laurentians, as you know, but he talks about Chalet Cochand and just in general what things were like in like the 30s when Emile Cochand was running the hotel. He says that by the 1930s, there were ski trains that would bring people up to the Laurentians, would bring as many as 10,000 people to the region every weekend, including to Chalet Cochand, obviously not 10,000. They had about 30 rooms or so. And in 1938, there are statistics for like the Christmas holiday period, and like 10,000 Americans showed up to spend the holidays there. And clients came from as far away, go to the next slide, as far away as Texas and Venezuela. So a lot of them would have come from, say, New England, and Montreal, but also it's renowned. It was quite renowned. People came from quite far away. And there's a whole history about how the region developed, which I won't get into now, but the train had a lot to do with this. The train really opened things up, and people would take the train up to the train station in Sainte-Marguerite, where there's now a dépanneur de la gare, and the trail, the Train du Nord trail is right there. They would get off there, and Cochand would send sleds to pick people up, and we'll talk a bit about that because Heidi has shared some stories about how the people from the village got involved in this. So Chalet Cochand attracted a lot of people who would have been considered from high society. One of the things I like to do, I have, if anybody's interested, I brought some postcards of Chalet Cochand. I have a little collection going. And one of the things I like to do, I especially like finding postcards that are inscribed on the back that people actually sent, because even though you can't trace the person sending the postcard, you can trace the person receiving. And often, we tend to hang around with the same type of person. So it's interesting to trace the history of the people who received postcards from Chalet Cochand. And often they would be, upper crust, upper society, academics, etc. That kind of professional class would have been the ones to come ski and stay at Chalet Cochand. So Emile and Léa Cochand, as I said, I don't want, we know Emile's story quite well. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I'm really interested in talking to you about Léa, who you may know a little less about. But just so you get a bit of context, Emile was born in Switzerland in 1890. And he was a ski champion. He came over to Quebec and worked at the ski school in Sainte-Adèle. In 1913, he met Léa. In 1914, he looked around, and the couple looked around, and they said, listen, we'd be interested in starting our own thing. Rather than me being an employee at a hotel, I'd like to start my own venture. And they had a friend who helped them find some land, Jack Kerr, he knew there was some land available near him, and that's when they started their adventure together. In his memoirs, he wrote, at that time it was rather difficult during the summer months. Summer sports were not en vigueur, as they say, and the north was considered rather a rough place to come because of mosquitoes and black flies. So it was primarily, I would say, a ski resort, but they needed to make it a year-round venture and needed to find ways to do that. And I think that Léa helped contribute to this evolution. And I'll explain to you why she was kind of the key to success of Chalet Cochand. Here is Leah, just a close-up view. I shared her signature here as well for the baptism of one of her children. Leah was from Switzerland as well. She was from the German part of Switzerland. Her name was Leah Berger, and she was from the La Seine area. She had come over to Quebec to work as a nanny for a Westmount type Anglo family. He ran a ski boutique in Montreal, so you can see where this is kind of going. She was already in that universe, and she, the family would come up to the Laurentians, etc. Often. Once the children that she was caring for were of age and were in school, obviously her nanny role started to lessen, and so she decided to stay in Sainte-Adèle, where she built her reputation as an excellent cook. And what you need to know about Leah is that she comes from a family of restaurateurs. So her parents owned a restaurant in Switzerland. As a young woman, Leah and her sister Hélène would work at the restaurant. And as they got a bit older, they decided to leave and come to Quebec. Both of them emigrated to Montreal, probably to the dismay of her parents, who now were left without help. Hélène married, had 3 children and stayed in Montreal. Leah, as I said, worked as a nanny and then was known, built her reputation as a cook. And that's really where her contribution was the most felt for Chalet Cochand. Chalet Cochand was known for its gastronomy. So yes, it was the first kind of ski resort or inn in the Laurentians. There was Grey Rocks, others were starting up as well. But what made Chalet Cochand really stand apart was Leah's cooking. So this is where the reputation was. People would come for this. They knew that they would come to a comfortable hotel where they would be very well fed. And Leah was quite dedicated. The kitchen was her domain. She was quite innovative. She introduced the fondue to the Laurentians. This was something that she brought from her tradition. And she was so dedicated that with the birth of her youngest son, Pierre, who went on to become quite a well-known artist, with her other children, she had given birth with midwives at Chalet Cochand. With this child, she was going to the hospital. He was the youngest. So it was kind of the transition to hospital births. So she had gone to the hospital, and Emile called the hospital and said, "Come back, Leah. We have surprise guests. They've just arrived and they need to be fed." And so the poor woman's in labor. We went to pick her up. They brought her back, and she cooked a meal for them. So you can imagine that it's not an easy life, and she really ran this kitchen. She was the key to the success. It's not something that she could delegate. She was a cordon bleu, and this was something that people really valued about her. Emile had a really good business relationship with an import-export company for everything related to the hotel. So they were able to be supplied with Gruyere cheese for fondue, and it really helped build the reputation of Chalet Cochand. They had a bit of a rough time with the war. The chalet, groups were really coming. They housed some soldiers who had TB and needed to recover. It was a bit of a rough time for them. In 1936, according to, I think this is from Joseph as well, by 1936, there were as many as 70 hungry skiers to feed in the evening, and Leah had a staff of 3 or 4 at that time. They had, I don't know if all of the resorts had this, but in Leah's time, they didn't have, I guess, a freezer attached to the hotel, as they would later on. They had a cellar that dug into the ground. So, and I wish I could find that, because I think it's great and I'd love to have it back again. Yes, sorry. Fondue, oui, c'est ça, gruyère. Fromage gruyère, c'est ça. A really traditional fondue that they introduced. I've spoken to many people about Leah, and they're all very complimentary, and her family really seems to adore her. I have the book of one of them, Charles Cochand, who's unfortunately passed away. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he's really the kind of the family historian, and talks about his aunt. I also spoke with Josette Cochand, and I spoke with Heidi Cochand, and they were all, obviously a lot of affection for this woman. So she was warm with her family. She was the matriarch. Apparently, when Louis ran the hotel in her old age, she would still come a couple of times a week to inspect things, make sure everything was running okay. She'd check out the waitresses, make sure that they were proper, their hair was proper and they were properly dressed. She would go into the kitchen, make sure everything was running okay. And apparently Louis, when his mama came, it was the matriarch, so he was very deferential to her. Unfortunately, she didn't have an easy time with Emile, with her husband, and eventually they divorced. And so she lived out her life at one of the cottages, one of the log cabins not too far away, where she would have her children and her grandchildren around her. So this is really the importance of Leah, really bringing a lot of the ambiance of Chalet Cochand to the time, rather than Emile. Here's the original building, the original farmhouse. It had no insulation, it had no running water, no heat, no lights, like there were lanterns around. The first winter was really, really difficult. And as I said, this particular building did burn down. Then there was the Chalet Cochand, as most of us know it now. And even that, it would, they would build extensions. It was constantly a work in progress. They would be, as their business evolved, they would add a few more bedrooms, etc. But I'll talk a bit about what it looked like. If we go to the next. As I said, in 1922, Emile was expanding the hotel, but in the middle of that reconstruction is when it all burned and he had to start all over again. That time with the new hotel, he installed central heating. Apparently it was radiators and it was quite temperamental. So, people who might come from New York, who might be used to the Ritz and the maybe more comfortable setting, this was more rustic. It really was that you were coming to, there was a kind of a fashion at the time that people who were in industrial cities were really yearning for country living, and this notion of Swiss rustic fresh air really appealed to them. And so when they came into the hotel, where the rooms were quite small, quite modest, each one had its own bathroom. You had a shared bath, however, so the bath itself would be shared with other guests, but you had your own toilet facilities, I suppose. So it still had a bit of an ensuite, but still it was, that the focus wasn't on luxurious bedrooms. You were meant to be in the common quarters, having fun with other guests, out on the ski hills, etc. So that's some of the building there for Chalet Cochand. As I said, Louis, one of his sons, took over the running of the hotel after the war. One of his sons, Emile, had the ski slopes. Louis had the hotel. The sense was that Emile was passing the hotel on, or sold the hotel, to perhaps his oldest and son, who I suppose in his mind, he felt really should take over the family business. It turns out that the ski slopes themselves were actually more lucrative than the hotel was. And so there was a bit of tension between the two brothers, with certain incidents going back and forth between the two.
What is the name of the
Emile.
No, Emile?
Yeah, Emile le père. There's Emile the father, and he had two sons, or three sons, but there was Louis and Emile Jr. Emile father, Emile Jr. Louis was in charge of the hotel, the ski chalet, and a restaurant called Restaurant Saint-Bernard, which was named for the dogs. They had these Saint Bernard dogs, the typical Swiss dogs, right? The big dogs with the barrels. They had that at the hotel. Emile Jr., the son, he had the cross-country trails and the downhill ski trail. Louis opened the downhill skis called the Swiss Hill, and that had a chairlift and a double T-bar. His wife, Morna, we'll talk about it a bit, was actually the owner of the lifts. She was the one who invested in that. And then they opened some restaurants. One was called the Swiss Hut, and then there was the bar, which was Nikki's. Nikki was the barman. They installed this double chairlift in 1958. And in the 50s, this Chalet Cochand was considered the kind of party place in the Laurentians. It was the place to go. So let's talk a bit about Louis. Louis, who was his son, excellent skier, champion skier. He coached the Olympic teams as well. And he was also in World War II fighter pilot. So he was quite renowned for that. So, a kind of glamorous person. I'm interested, though, in talking to you about his wife, Morna. So if we can just go to the next one. Here you have the social and personal column of the Montreal Gazette announcing her engagement to Louis Cochand. You'll see that it's not a photo of the couple. It is the photo of Morna. That's because she's Morna McLean. And the McLean family was a very important family in Montreal. And I'll introduce you to them in a second. Here you have a bit of a family photo, the McLeans at Chalet Cochand with her father, with her parents, Charlie and Doris, with many of the children and their partners. So Morna has been described by all as a force of nature. Even the people who knew her best knew her like this, but even the wait staff, when they were impressed by Morna. She had a presence. She certainly didn't leave anybody indifferent. She was very well traveled. She came from a family of means. They had a big house in Point Claire, and were quite well off. And she brought in a lot of ideas. So the fondue, which Leah had introduced, she kind of brought that up a notch and made that really well known. The raclette, she kind of innovated a lot with the idea of serving food at the bar so people could drink, which is where the hotel made a lot of its money, and eat at the same time. The challenge was really to keep people entertained because there were some winters where there wasn't that much snow. So maybe skiing conditions weren't so great. You wanted to make sure you kept people at the hotel spending money. And so she brought in a lot of ideas. One of the wait staff that I introduced had an interesting impression of Morna. She said, for her, Louis and Morna were always quite distant. She knew they were the owners, but they never really mixed with the staff. They had people to kind of manage, right, directly. So for her, this was an impressive couple, glamorous, distant, wasn't too sure, what to make of them. Her memories of Morna is that she would spend her time. Now, this particular person had been employed at Chalet Cochand in the summer. So this was summertime, but even winter, apparently people did this. She loved sunbathing. And so she remembers Morna being very, very tan, very glamorous in her bikini. Apparently she was a bit challenging with the chef. She would send him recipes from American magazines, blueberry muffin recipes or whatever, and suggest that he add this to his menu. And when you're a professional chef, you don't necessarily like people interfering with your process. So apparently that was a bit of a challenge. Morna and Louis had several children. Many of them survived, some did not. There was, in fact, quite a tragic death. They lost a son at 3 years of age, but had several children, including somebody I had the pleasure of interviewing before she passed away, Josette Cochand, who was Eugène Chadel's widow. I spoke with her, and when you speak to a Cochand, I think it must be in the blood. It's a McLean. I don't know if it's the McLean or the Cochand, but they are fabulous storytellers, and they have great affection for this time period in their families' history. So I hope to meet others. As I said, one of their children is Charles Cochand, who I did speak to. He lived in England, so we didn't meet in person, but I had the pleasure of buying his book. I'm not sure if his book is still available, but it really is his version of his family's history. And if you can get it, I would encourage you to pick it up. Morna McLean, as I said, came from a very prominent family in Montreal. Charles Wesley McLean was a lieutenant. He was an outstanding athlete. He was the son of a civil engineer, so not necessarily, he wasn't the son of necessarily the highest society, but he did marry an heiress. So he married the heiress, Martha Fulford. She was the heiress to something called the Pink Pills for Pale People. And these pills were quite popular at the time. And the idea was that they could cure almost anything. So you could take this as like passe-partout type of pill. It could cure eczema. It could cure paralysis. It could cure rickets. And the family had made their fortune this way. She unfortunately died shortly after giving birth. The child passed away as well. And so Charles McLean was left widowed as a widower. And so he remarried, and he remarried a woman called Doris Thornton Aldous, who would be the mother of all of these children that went on to obviously join the Cochand family legacy. And she had been the granddaughter of Sir Henry Bate, who was an entrepreneur, and her father was the head of Hudson's Bay Land Department. So that family, again, was quite glamorous, Louis Cochand marrying Doris Aldous. And so Morna was used to this life of privilege. The family would come up to the Laurentians to ski. And so that's where at Chalet Cochand, they came to Chalet Cochand, Morna met Louis. And apparently it was love at first sight. It was like fireworks everywhere. Okay, I want to talk to you a bit about the buildings themselves. As you walk into the front door of the hotel, now again, I want to say something is that I've interviewed several people, and everybody, and this is the case with personal history in general, what you need to know, people will publish their memoirs. Let me put it this way. People will publish their memoirs. Lori will publish her memoir, and she will write her memories down to the best of her recollection. Best thing to do is to put a disclaimer at the front of that, because memories are very subjective, and our memories actually evolve with time, and they're tainted by what other people tell us about things that happen. That's why sometimes you have a memory and you swear you were there, and your mother will say, well, you weren't even born when that happened, so how could you possibly remember? Okay, and so I will say that I've interviewed several people, and for me, this is a bit like a puzzle. I'm slowly trying to put pieces together. I haven't interviewed even half of the people I'd love to interview to try to get a better picture. And so I'm bringing a lot of different impressions together, people who were there at different eras as well. So it's possible that the kind of simplified version that I'm about to present might not quite jive with your own memories of the hotel. But from what I understand, you would walk up to the hotel into the main doors. Are you okay, Chloe? Just crouched on the ground.
I'm fine.
My goodness, you're in a chair. I just realized.
No, I'm good.
You would walk into the front door, up I guess, a couple of steps, and through the front door, immediately you'd be greeted by the reception desk and the receptionist. Behind her desk was the office where Louis and his assistant would spend a lot of their time organizing everything that a good hotel needed to be run smoothly. There was a staircase that would go up to guest rooms on one side and staff quarters on the other. There were a couple of rooms for staff. It wasn't the main staff living area, but the receptionist, for example, had her quarters there. To the right, you had a big dining room. On the left, you had a big living room with big couches and chairs and a stone fireplace. To the left of the reception, you had a gift shop. Across from the gift shop was a bar, and you had a restaurant. That's where Nikki of Nikki's bar fame worked. There's a bartender, and later he would have Nikki's restaurant. And he was really well known because apparently he would give kids extra cherries. That's what one of my interviewees made sure that I knew. To the right of the bar were the washrooms, and down that hallway, there were like the women's washrooms. Across from that was the beauty salon. So imagine, like, I mean, when I'm standing on my land, it's hard for me to imagine that this building was there and housed all these things. I'm not even done. So you had the beauty salon and some offices. Down the hall, you would have a playroom that had ping pong table and a view out onto the pools. There was a basement for storage, and obviously the boilers and things were probably there. In the attic, Leah had a lot of things stored up there. She was really good at bringing out and making the ambiance of the place come to life. At the back of the hotel was the kitchen. And so there you had kind of like not a loading dock, but you had the place where the supplies would be delivered. They would come through the front door of the hotel, which makes sense. You would also have the door where the wait staff would go out. So the wait staff and clients wouldn't go through the same entrances. And so there was wait staff, for example, that would go serve people by the pool. They would always go through that back door. They wouldn't go through the guest door. That was forbidden. And in fact, it was kind of quite segregated as to who could eat in the dining rooms. So some of the staff could, like the ski instructors could eat. They had their table with the clients in the dining room. The receptionist could go into the bar, and the nanny, the guy who ran the couple who ran the gift shop and the hair salon could go to the bar. But for example, the woman who ran the stables could not. The maintenance staff, they wouldn't come into the Chalet Cochand bar itself. And so clients, as I said, were really well fed, and they also were really well entertained. And if we could just go to the next, I want to give you just this kind of overview of Chalet Cochand. So you can see, I mean, the hotel is quite big. It's hard for me to imagine really, but my land is here. And in fact, my house is, I think that tiny, yes, it is definitely the tiny little home here, which has changed. And I'll show you some photos. My neighbor's home is still there up on the hill. I think that might have been Louis' home, Louis and Morna's home. I'm not 100% sure. What you have is the main hotel here with its circular driveway, which is still there. And I'll show you a photo that shows that a bit better. The building to the far, as you're looking at the photo to the far right, was a two-story building where the staff quarters were. So the wait staff would live there. They lived on the second story, so the upper floor of this building. The lower floor was used for storing equipment. It was kind of like the, I guess, pseudo kind of garage or whatever. That's where equipment was. On top of that was the staff quarters. You can see the ski runs. That's all wooded area now. That's behind my home. And the building here is still there as well. That's my neighbor's place. They have a big rock, and that was where the ski lift was at the time. So people who remember Chalet Cochand will remember that. A lot of the buildings aren't there anymore. These two buildings at the front, which I know at least one of them is kind of the pool house. I'm not too sure what the other one is. There were two pools on the property, so there might be two pool houses. I'm not sure. Those are gone, and obviously the main hotel is gone as well. It's very funny for me that people are parked there. Like, if somebody parked on my lawn, I would not be happy. But this was used as parking. And then across the road is the hill down to the auberge. There's an auberge down by the lake, and so I have 6 acres on the far side as well. And now that's all trees. Like I could ski down. It would just be a little trickier. So it's kind of a bit more overgrown now. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. Circular driveway, as I said, still there. So you see how you would come up to the main door of the building. And here they're playing croquet. There were just a lot of activities. It's kind of like going to a Club Med, I suppose, The idea was really to keep people entertained and to make sure that they left having had a lot of fun and being really, really well fed. And a lot of the postcards that I collect are testimonials to that. Should we go to the next one? I just want to show you again a better view of the entrance. This parking lot is still there. So for those of you who ski, if you ski the Maple Leaf Trails up in the hill, you may know this parking lot because the owner, who is my neighbor, allows people, it's private land, but he allows people to park there. So it's a bit of a, people think it's public, which causes problems. There are mailboxes there as well, which obviously weren't there at the time. And then I just want to give you kind of, as we move away from the hotel, a bit of a farther view. So this would be on the other side of the road. You see Chalet Cochand and its kind of distinct style. And then even farther from across the hill, you can see here a better view of the staff living quarters. They would have been on the second story. The stables would have been even farther along, out of frame here, but farther away. I'm not sure who the mother and child are. That might be Morna and one of her kids. Heidi could tell us. And then even farther away across the hill. So you see, like, I mean, how expansive it is. And so you had the main hotel and many exterior buildings, so cottages that families could rent, but also that ski instructors would stay in. Okay, next one. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Okay, here's the hotel interior. You can see a bit of the style. This is the dining room and bar. I interviewed a gentleman who's a ski instructor. He's from New Zealand. He came over from New Zealand. They all take a kind of a gap year. And so he came over from New Zealand to work in Sainte-Adèle and then at Chalet Cochand. He says the bar was fabulous. He says that there was a wrought iron fireplace on legs that had a hood, and there was an open fire all winter. We don't see it in the photo. What he did mention, though, was that you have the coat of arms, the various Swiss coats of arms behind. So the Swiss character of the place was really, really important, all the way from the decor to the way the waitresses dressed to the two dogs. You know, it was really a big part of the family's identity and a part of the cachet of Chalet Cochand. Here's another interior view. This photo was taken by Réal Coutier, who was an engineer for CP Rail, and he worked with Jack Rabbit Johansson, who I'll talk about very briefly because you all know him quite well, to design the Maple Leaf Trail. So you can see here and this may be the fireplace that Des was talking about earlier. And another view of the interior here. I imagine the kind of living room or lounge type area. Okay, and here just a view of the pool. All the photos not fabulous, but here you would see the kind of balcony on the first floor was the sun lounge that they called, and there were staff bedrooms on that upper floor as well. So the pool, which Emile Cochand had designed and had built, was a cold water pool. It wasn't a heated pool. Louis later brought in a heated pool, which was kidney shaped towards the end of Chalet Cochand's existence, if you will. As I mentioned, the skiers would often come by rail with their skis. It was a big party train, big festive ambiance. They would get off at the train station in Sainte-Marguerite. The area was called Sainte-Marguerite Station. It would be referred to as Sainte-Marguerite Station rather than Sainte-Adèle or Sainte-Marguerite-Lac-Masson. The hotel is actually in both municipalities. So I pay taxes to both. I pay taxes to Sainte-Marguerite and to Sainte-Adèle. Emile Cochand, the building of the hotel was actually it overflowed. So part of it was in Sainte-Marguerite, part of it was in Sainte-Adèle. There's a famous story which you probably heard. Back in the day, we didn't have municipal elections all on the same day in November. It could be different dates. And on that date, on election date, you couldn't sell alcohol. And so when it was Sainte-Adèle's election day, the Cochands would move the bar to the Sainte-Marguerite side of the building. Clever, huh? Always thinking, these people, always thinking. And just a quick shot of what the train situation would have looked like. So really just part of the whole experience. You know, it was an experience to go. Later, the highway came in and people would come up for the day and ski. You know, they wouldn't go to the hotel, they would go to in his ski slopes and then go back home. At one time, it was really an entire experience to come, and the train was part of that experience. The ski lift. I'm not sure if this is the one that Morna invested in. She owned the ski lift, so this was her own investment. There's a bit of a story about how she had to negotiate with her brother-in-law. Emile at one point was getting all the ski traffic, like people would go ski on his hills. There were hills behind, but they weren't as exciting, I imagine, as the ones out front. So people would go ski on Emile's side of the property, and he wasn't really interested in revenue sharing. And Morna was like, well, I'm sending you all these people, like you should be revenue sharing with me. And so she actually invested in her own ski lift. And then I think they managed to come to an agreement. So I suspect that there was like, a bit of a détente as far as revenue went, because he saw that she was a woman, a determined woman. And if she couldn't convince him that she would keep clients on her side of the hill. At Chalet Cochand, you could do tons of activities, as I said. Morna and Louis were really interested in skeet shooting. You could do horseback riding. You could use the pool. You could golf. At one point, I do have postcards where you see that there's like a sign saying that there's golf on the land, although that seems to be debatable. Mostly, they would send people to the golf club by the Alpine Inn. But just, not too far, right? They always wanted people to come back for dinner, etc. Obviously, you had ski and you had the fondue dinners as well. You had, at one point, water skiing, and they had championships were there, like kind of international water skiing championships. And even people who aren't that old, I would say they're, I don't know how old Michel would be, one of my former neighbors, but he remembers water skiing. And it wasn't that long ago, Yeah, you remember, and you're like a jeunesse. So this I perhaps continued in the Yvan Couture period as well. And just a shot of the ski lift here. I want to talk about some of the people that would have worked with the Cochands. One of them was Victor Naimark. I don't want to go into him too much. You probably do know at least the name, especially if you're from Saint-Sauveur. Big developer. Victor Naimark was super important for the region. He had come over from Finland, had moved to the Laurentians at one point, was really into skiing himself. He was hired to work on the construction of the Montebello hotel by, I think it's CP Rail that owned the hotel at the time. So I have had the pleasure of meeting his son, Bill, exchanging with his grandchildren as well. And so Bill, when he came, I was curious to get the confirmation that Victor Naimark had built my home. I suspected it because I could see the similarities with the Montebello, but I just wanted to be sure. And in fact, the gentleman, Mr. Naimark, came, was kind enough to come and kind enough to tell me about his father's work. So here you see the Montebello, which was, an impressive building. 10,000 logs were used to build this building. They had to do it within 90 days. That included staff quarters and everything. It had a lot of really innovative things with the heating system, water system, etc. If you go, Kwe, you're okay. Kwe is earning her keep today. You can see that what Bill told me was that my home is very typical of Victor Naimark construction. You can see here the way that the logs are carved. Does it strike anybody as strange? Often what he tells me is that what people will do today, because it's much easier, is that they will put the logs stacked on top of each other in a U shape, like a boat shape. So you will have the U, and then the next log will rest on top of that. You'll see that this is the opposite. The U is on the bottom and the log is underneath. The advantage of this, much smarter, is that water doesn't accumulate in that kind of boat area, right? So this is definitely a Victor Naimark kind of signature piece. So he carved each log, each tree, so that they would fit into one another, log upon log. It's super well insulated. It's cool in summer, warm in winter. It's fabulous house. He considered that square logs were a waste. He used round logs. And he used a stain that was made from linseed oil and turpentine, and the color was made from, the effect was made from burnt umber. And the linseed oil would be used to preserve the logs. So I actually have to my surprise, maintain this. I didn't think I had to. I thought that, you know, it was just lovely and permanent as it is, but I do have to protect it myself. And today we don't use the linseed oil and the rest. So there's a special product that I use. And I just hope that I maintain it properly. Apparently I am, because I think it's really important to maintain that legacy. You can see a bit on the inside. Now this fancy white carved window is not original. This is not everything that is dentelle, like how do you say in English? Lacy decoration is not original, but I wanted to show you the windows, which obviously are. So inside and out, the house is like this kind of dark wood, except for one of the rooms, which one of the previous owners has painted. They also painted the stone fireplace, which is a shame. But I think that they really, like the white here, they really wanted to brighten up the place. But you can see the pine floors, which are very wide, and they're put diagonally, which apparently was quite typical of his constructions as well. Just another quick look at the way the logs are. You see the shape is really typical for him. And then finally, again, this lacy type of decor is absolutely not him. My house now has a bell tower and it's quite cute. My sister thinks it's terrible, but it's quite cute. It lights up, there's a bell, you can pull the bell and it rings, much to my neighbor's dismay when children come. But it was added by a later owner of the building, and again, not original. It's original to me, but not original to Mr. Nymark. Okay, very quickly, Jack Rabbit Johansson. The link here to the Cochand is that Emile Cochand hired Jack Rabbit Johansson along with other members of the kind of Ski Resorts Association to develop the Maple Leaf Trail. So he came from Norway. He had a degree in mechanical engineering. He went to the States for a while and then moved to Canada and set up first in Montreal and then in what's now Piedmont, Shawbridge, Piedmont, where he had worked in the States for a company that sent him to Northern Ontario, where he met the Crees. He was working quite closely with the Crees, and they gave him the name Jack Rabbit. And he was a big fan of cross-country skiing. In fact, he said in interviews later in his life that he never understood downhill skiing. That's just up and down like a yo-yo. That's useless. You need to exercise every day. It needs to be vigorous. You have to get your heart going. And for him, that was cross-country skiing. Downhill skiing was a mystery. He did not approve. Did not approve. So you see here, it's a first time I've seen a photo of his family. I thought it was kind of nice to show his kids. And so you'll see here, like these names will be familiar to you. You know, Maple Leaf Trail and all the big network of trails. Just a little link with Cochand. I'm told, I won't name names, that Emile Cochand wasn't thrilled with the level of notoriety to which Jack Rabbit Johansson grew. He was a bit miffed because he had actually financed Jack Rabbit Johansson's work, and Jack Rabbit Johansson got all the credit. So, you know, but Jack Rabbit Johansson was quite affable and had a big personality, and as you know, lived to a venerable age. I think he passed away. He was, how old was he? Like 111? Is that possible? Like quite old. And he had gone back to Norway to live out his days. But he was in Laurentians for a very, very long time. Next person I want to talk to you about, in fact, a couple, is Fritz Shannon. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. He was a champion skier. He did ski jumping. She was his lovely and petite wife who had a fabulous voice, and they were known for two things. Fritz was known as a skier. He was a ski instructor at Chalet Cochand for quite a while. They were also musicians. He played the accordion and she yodeled. So there exists a record, which I own, and is at the ski museum in Saint-Sauveur, if you can ever convince them to play it for you, of the couple. And they were big names at the time. They were the entertainers for Chalet Cochand at the time period that they were there. They had a radio program, like they were quite well known. I wonder if I can show the video quite quickly, just so we can see. I want to give you a sense of who Fritz was. We'll see if this works. So we're going to play a YouTube video. We're going to share the sound. Yeah, perfect. Okay, I hope everybody online can see this.
Yeah, we're sharing.
Under the towering peak of Mont Blanc, the skiing contests of the International Week have drawn champions from many lands.
You hear the
The start of the men's downhill race,
so they would play
the supreme test for every competitor.
With a certain age.
Rough going.
Here's the ski run. Now Fritz
Therefore,
wins this competition.
one stretch takes a heavy toll as
It's a
the rest of the
rough
field
ride.
follow on. And there goes the young Frenchman Lacroix, beginning the run which gained him first place in brilliant style.
Fritz, I think, is the next one.
Always a high spot of the International Week, the ski jumping became a close contest between the French and the Swiss. Here goes Fritz Shannon, the Swiss ace,
Here's
with
Fritz
the
now.
jump that gained him the highest honors in a tournament of champions.
Let's see who he has. You know, pretty good looking guy. So apparently he was quite built, imposing type of guy, but he was also a musician. So he had the entertainers, charisma as well. So you can see that, you know, Fritz would have been one of maybe the star instructors for Chalet Cochand. Whoops, sorry. We'll start it again. Fritz Shannon, Marilee? Oh, I'll show you the record in a second when we're able to go back. Sorry. We're just going to shut this off.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll show you. I've got the, we'll go back to our screen. Oh, sorry. That's fine. Thank God for Chloe. I would not want to be doing this. Good. I'll leave it like that. Okay, great. We can go if we can go down one. So we see Fritz here. If we go down to the next one, this is the video we just watched. Yeah, this is the cover of the album I was telling you about. This is the one here. Ski time music at Chalet Cochand. And you can see the sign, Chalet Cochand Ski School, with the hours for the skiing and the hills in the background. Is the dog there? I don't know if that's the dog in the background, maybe. So he was really an exceptional skier. He had competed in ski jumping. He joined the national team in 1945. He won Swiss championships. He broke the world ski flying record in Slovenia with a jump of 120 meters. That in 1948. That's probably what we just saw. He was asked to coach the U.S. ski jumping team, but he didn't get a work permit. Now that would make that happen in a second. So instead, he came to Canada and he worked at Chalet Cochand and had his music on the side, entertainer, radio show with his wife. So Fritz and Marilee worked at Chalet Cochand. She would often in the summer help with the summer camps. Like she'd help run the summer camps, but really the main role as a couple was as the entertainer. They went back to Switzerland in 1964 and he founded a music school there, and they lived there until his and when he retired in 1999, and he taught music, etc. Pretty sure he's passed away now, though I'm not 100% sure. I imagine he must be. Okay, let's move on to other people. Now, some of these photos, unfortunately, I don't have pictures of the real people. So I have inserted, just for effect, some photos of the era. Marie Cox is a name that came up a lot in recollections of people who worked at Chalet Cochand. She was Louis Cochand's right-hand man. She was, we would call her director of operations probably today. She was known as his secretary. So she would have been the one in the back office working with him, the office that was behind the reception desk. The receptionist says that when people would phone in to reserve, she would pass the phone over to Marie. Marie was responsible for hiring. She hired the receptionist. The chef would hire his staff. Marie would hire her staff. I'm not sure who hired the groundskeepers, if that was Marie as well. The head of the ski instructors would hire his staff. But Marie was really instrumental in running the hotel. She was British. She was a redhead. She was kind of, again, just considered to be one of the instrumental people. As the receptionist said, or the waitress, sorry, said, they felt a distance with the owners, with Louis and Morna. You know, they didn't really deal with them directly. Marie was somebody that they would deal with. So when the lady who worked as reception was hired, she had written to Marie Cox, and she dealt with Marie Cox directly. So Marie was a really instrumental person in the Cochand legacy. And we see here, there's some mentions of her in society pages. So she had a certain prominence. She was quite well known. In fact, she's referred to as somebody well known in one of these. Here we have her coming back from a trip south, covering 4,000 miles in her little 4-cylinder English car, and seeing only a single pair of Quebec plates in Florida. Now, if Marie went back to Florida today, it'd be very different. But you know, you have the impression of somebody who had an adventurous spirit, who was independent, etc. Here is a later article. Marie Cox has now left Chalet Cochand. She had gone overseas, if I'm not mistaken. She had gone to New Zealand. But now she had come back to Pittsburgh, and she was the manager of the coffee shop in the new Pittsburgh Hilton, which, you know, isn't a banal thing. You know, it wasn't considered an important position. And the Gazette was just saying that she was back in the Laurentians. So she was part of the society pages. So, you know, she had a certain notoriety. People knew who she was, obviously kind of client facing as far as Chalet Cochand goes. I want to introduce you to, this is again, not Miss Bacon. This is the receptionist. So this represents Sheila Bacon, now Collins, who was a receptionist. She was 22 years old when she worked as a receptionist from November to August 1955 to 56. Miss Collins now lives and lived then in England. She had come over to Toronto because she had family here, worked in Toronto for a while, didn't particularly care for it, was looking for another opportunity, heard through a coworker that there was maybe an opening at Chalet Cochand. And so she jumped on that opportunity, wrote or phoned, she's not sure, Marie Cox, who she suspects hired her because she was a fellow Brit. So there was the countryman link, linked them together. And she took a train from Toronto to Montreal, a long train journey, she says. So obviously, you know, not the faster train ride we have today. And then a long bus journey through the mountains. The snow got thicker and thicker. You know, it's we take it for granted now with the highway and everything, but it was more of a process back then. She got off at the station. It was after hours. She'd expected to be greeted at the station, but there was nobody there for her. So she asked around, and they got her a taxi, and they dropped her off at Chalet Cochand. And somebody says, "Who are you?" And she says, "I'm here for the job. I've been hired." "Okay, great. Here's your room. Go, you know, take it easy, and tomorrow morning we'll introduce you to Marie Cox." And that's where her work began. She got along really, really well with Marie Cox and with a lot of people who worked at the hotel and socialized with them. As I said, the receptionist was one of the employees who had the permission to socialize, to be in the bar, to be in the restaurant. And so she met the nanny, the Cochand's nanny, and socialized with her, met the couple. One of the women ran the gift shop, and she socialized with her as well. She remembers ski instructors who came from Norway, who came from Sweden, who were Swiss, who were Canadian. It was quite international. We know there were some from New Zealand as well. She actually was quite relieved because on St. Patrick's Day, not relieved for this reason, on St. Patrick's Day, so she'd been there since November, St. Patrick's Day, she broke her leg skiing. And she has a memory of the Cochand children coming to her rescue. So she remembers them that way. And she was grateful because she thought that Louis Cochand might send her way, because a receptionist with a broken leg, you know, she thought wouldn't be good optics. And in fact, people would ask her how she broke her leg, and she would tell them she broke it skiing. So, but she was very grateful because Monsieur Cochand kept her on. And as I said, she stayed until August. Yeah, one of the employees did talk about salary, and her impression was that, you know, probably like a lot of service type of jobs, it wasn't going to make you rich. I think for a lot of people, this was an experience. So like I said, the ski instructor came from New Zealand. He had come during his gap year. She had come because she was similarly traveling from England for this kind of experience. So they enjoyed themselves greatly. They got 50% off their bar tab. There were other ways to be compensated. A lot of them were really interested in learning how to ski. And so this was an opportunity for that. Her memory was that Morna was fabulous, that the family was lovely. She remembers the dogs with the barrels under the skin, under the chin, sorry. She remembers the guests who were quite impressive to her. And some of them were excellent skiers. They were Olympic skiers who would come to Chalet Cochand. So for her, it was really her best time in Canada, where it was the time that she spent working at Chalet Cochand. I want to introduce you to Des Brow. Des Brow lives in New Zealand, lived in New Zealand then, lives in New Zealand now, but he did come to Canada for what he calls my big OE, which is the Great Overseas Experience. Meryl might know that expression. I'm not sure if they use it in Britain as well, but it's basically your gap year. He went away for 3 years, and he had gone to the UK and then came over from Montreal. He knew Harvey Clifford, who was the head of all the ski instructors at Chalet Cochand. And so that was kind of his in. But he'd actually gone to work at a hotel in Sainte-Adèle. He thought it was a permanent position. He arrived to work for the Christmas season. And to his surprise, after the rush of the Christmas season, the owner said, "Thanks very much for coming from overseas, but we don't have any more work for you." And so he was unemployed. And so he called Harvey Clifford and said, "Help, I'm far from home and I need a job." And Harvey said, "Well, buddy, come on over." And so his friend Harvey Clifford got him a job at Cochand. He didn't ski at the time, so instead they put him on as a maintenance kind of groundskeeper. I'll introduce you to those people a little bit later and talk to you about his experience. But just so that you get a bit of context, after a very short period of time, he'd started to learn to ski. After about a week of skiing, he was hired as a ski instructor and taught the beginners, obviously. So he was like a week ahead of his students, basically is what it was. But obviously, week after week, a new group would come in. So he would always be building more experience and working with the beginners. And he's 88 today. He was 24 at the time. So he was there in the winter season of 1957. And so he remembers, again, just like the receptionist, from a social perspective, like socializing, how fabulous it was. That the ski instructors lived together, that they had the discount at the bar, that they could socialize with guests. So for him, it was a very important and interesting experience. He went on to work with the ski instructor, with Harvey Clifford in New Zealand, because Harvey Clifford would go between both resorts. You might remember 2 or 3 weeks ago, Louis Dufour passed away from Les Sommets in Saint-Sauveur. And they did something for him, which people may remember from back in the day. And I'm not sure how often we see this anymore, but right away I thought of Des when I saw this, because this is what they used to do at Chalet Cochand. So here what you see is a very, and it's not a very clear image, but what it is are skiers skiing down the hill at night with torches. Now they don't use the kind of kerosene torches that they used back in the day. They were very smoky, oily, and kind of dangerous. What he recounts is that on Wednesday nights, was it Wednesday nights? Yeah, Wednesday nights at Chalet Cochand were fondue nights. And the guests would be brought across the lake, up the hill to what he says is a hut, the restaurant, where the chef would have kind of transported his staff, and they would have a fondue feast. And after the fondue dinner, each instructor would lead his class down the hill. So the instructor would be skiing with the torches, and then you would try to follow him down the hill. And so for the guests who stayed behind, because not everyone would go for that meal, it would be quite a sight to see this at the end of the evening. He talks a bit about the schedule. So he remembers very clearly the man's 88 and he worked there in 27 and he remembers like it was yesterday. So this is just fabulous. The ski school schedule was daily 10 to 11:30. You had ski lessons, and in the afternoon again 2 to 3:30. From a social perspective, again, really important to keep the guests entertained. Saturday nights, the guests would arrive. And also they were kind of students from Montreal who would come to ski during the day. On Sunday, it was movie night for the guests, kind of a mellow weekend, but then the program really began on Monday. So Monday night, you had a tea dance, and then you had dinner and drinks. There was a set menu for dinner. Tuesday nights, you had broom ball outdoors after dinner, and there were big floodlights. So this was very exciting kind of game for the guests. On Wednesday night, Jack Rabbit Johansson would take guests on cross-country ski excursions, and then they would have their fondue night in the evening after building up that appetite. They would have their fondue night and ski down the hill afterwards. Thursday night was fancy dress. Fancy dress, I didn't know. I thought fancy dress was tuxedos and ball gowns. No, fancy dress apparently is costumes. So the guests would dress up in costumes. They would improvise costumes based on what they had. So that was a fun evening. There's a lot of, I mean, from listening to people's stories, a lot of fun, like you would have at a Cuban resort today, right? There's this kind of ambiance. Friday night, there was a special dinner and the chef would make bomb Alaska, and it was flambe. So it's a dessert that's kind of like a hill. It's white, and then you light it on fire. And this is very dramatic. And the wait staff would like parade through the dining room. It was a whole big event. And then on Saturday, after having this fabulous dinner, the guests would leave. And then a new group would arrive on Saturday. He also remembers that there were sugar bush parties. In fact, the waitress remembers that as well, even though she's sad because she had a cast and couldn't go. But there were sugar bush parties up in the hills behind the hotel. I'm going to move on to a couple whose daughter, her name is Claudia Jarman Corbat, and she's a contemporary of the Cochand children. So she was friends with Heidi and others. She talks about the events that they would have for children. And one of the things that they would do is they would have these kind of winter games. And the balloons that you see here are balloons that they would tie to the kind of sleds that would be part of the procession. And each balloon had the tag with the name of the child. And the children would release the balloons, and the one that made it the farthest, like a week later, they would find the one that made it farthest. If it was Claudia, well, she won the big prize of the day that day. So, you know, again, these are people of a certain age, but their memories of these events are really, really strong. Here, I think this is Claudia as well, if I'm not mistaken. You see you know, they would have games for the children and keep them well entertained. In fact, what they would do is they had each resort had their own team, and they would all compete. All the children would compete. And then the next slide. Here you see the trophies, and in fact, Miss Jarman has donated her collection of trophies to the Sainte-Marguerite Historical Society. So we have some of those now, and in fact, probably some of the trophies you see in this photo. So, you know, again, a bit like at a resort, you would have things to entertain the kids. At a family-friendly resort, it was the same thing here. And every person I've interviewed who was a child at that time, I could do an entire presentation just on the children's experience at Chalet Cochand. It was obviously a very magical time for all of them. Claudia's parents, the Jarmans, were at one point the hairdresser and the owner of the shop at Chalet Cochand. So they rented space, like they weren't employees, they were business people. They rented space at Chalet Cochand. She was the hairdresser. This is not her. Again, just a stock photo, unfortunately. She had her hair salon, and again, a luxury. It's rustic hotel, but still, you had the luxury of a hair salon because they would have these evening events, and ladies would like to be properly coiffed, right? And he ran the store, which is also in the hotel. He would sell a lot of things that you might need for skiing, so clothing and things like this, and obviously other sundries that you might need. Later on, after they left, because they left and they opened, he opened a kind of his own business as a supplier for hotels and resorts. She had her hair salon in the family home. They built an extension, and she had her salon at the home, which was just the next street over, close to Chalet Cochand. The lady who took over the little store, Annalise, moved the shop to the basement, but hers was more of cigarettes, food or snacks kind of store, not as elaborate as his was. In fact, at one point, and I'm not sure when, my honeymoon suite, my home, would have been a shop as well. So at one point, it would have been used as a store. Okay, great. Next person I want to introduce you to, and I don't want to keep it too long, it's already 2:30, is the waitress. Now, I had the pleasure of introducing Michelle Gay. This was a few years ago. She was 75 at the time, and she worked there towards the end of the Cochand era. So she worked there from July until mid-September 1960. So not in the winter, in the summer period. She had just finished École Normale, like her high school, and her mother decided she needed work experience. And she started off working at somewhere else, Manoir Richelieu, but didn't really like it there. And so the chef at Manoir Richelieu, his real job, his full-time job was being the chef at Chalet Cochand. He was Hungarian, and he said, listen, why don't you come? There's work up there, you'll be happier up north. And she was. She had another one who had a great experience. And she was trained, but she wasn't like a professional like some of the others would have been. And she was the new girl. So they put her out to be service at the pool, which was less prestigious. People didn't like that job because you actually had to run quite a bit from the pool to the kitchen, back and forth, taking orders, bringing out food. At one point she says it was great because they like upgraded her and she had a little cart. So she could wheel around her cart with her sandwiches and things like that. She introduced, I don't know if she was the one to introduce or maybe Morna had, and she kind of launched it, but the Subway sandwich, the kind of Subway sandwich was something that they brought on. She remembers mint parfait, and it's true, it doesn't sound great. She says it wasn't great. It was like white vanilla ice cream, and then you would put crème de menthe on top and some other mint thing. That was really, really popular. I think a certain generation, mint was a big thing, because didn't you like put mint with turkey and things like that? I think it seems very 50s, 60s to me. She was bilingual, so that definitely helped. She worked with, she socialized. Part of her role was to socialize with guests as well. It wasn't just the service, it was also chatting with guests. She could spend 50 minutes chatting with somebody. Again, that was part of how, you left with a warm feeling that you were appreciated at Chalet Cochand. That was part of the deal. So yeah, I mean, her experience again was quite a positive one. If we take a look at the next, you see some of the shots of the pool, but you see that, here we have it's probably a competition of some kind because they have all the people in the stands, but you have the little, the hut, you have the balcony overlooking the sun deck, overlooking. I think actually if you go back to the previous one, we might see the fence that she was talking about. Oh, no, you don't. Remember that I said the wait staff went at the back door. So the pool house was kind of surrounded by a wooden fence, and there was a gate. So they would use that gate and then they would go serve people. So, the wait staff had their own process. Last but not least, I want to talk to you about the people who were responsible for this. So this, I don't think was unique to Chalet Cochand. Probably they did it at other resorts. but this was super popular. What they would do is in front of the hotel, you can see it's kind of facing the road. They would build these walls of big blocks of ice, and people would come sun. It's not in this photo. There's another fabulous photo where you see the women with their metal, the metal plates, which you would never do, girl. Like just anyway, but back then it was very fashionable. Like I said, Morna, who would have been setting the tone for everybody, they were very fashionable, Louis and Morna. And they modeled, like you see them in magazines, modeling ski outfits, which were also kind of innovative for the era. Before then, you would just kind of ski in your clothes. And then at some point in like the 50s or 40s or 50s, they actually developed kind of ski outfits, and they were fashion plates. So Morna would have been a fashion model kind of example for people, influencer, we would say today. And she was big on getting sun, and it was really, really popular activity at Chalet Cochand. So I want to talk to you about the people responsible for this. Des Brau, who you might remember, the ski instructor, worked temporarily when he first arrived at Chalet Cochand before he had his week's worth of experience skiing as the kind of ground staff. And this staff would have been people mostly from Sainte-Marguerite. People from Sainte-Marguerite, as I said, Heidi could not emphasize enough how important they were to the success of Chalet Cochand. She said that if they hadn't had the support of the people of Sainte-Marguerite, Chalet Cochand couldn't have worked. So they worked, as the cleaning staff. They worked as ground staff. Often they would be unilingual francophones, so they wouldn't necessarily be client-facing, but they would be working, among other things, to get the ice. So again, we're talking pre-refrigeration, pre-electricity. What they would do is they would go to the lake, not necessarily the lake on my property. They would go into Sainte-Marguerite, to Lake Masson, and they would carve out these huge blocks of ice. There's a whole process involved that includes sprinkling brincy, sprinkling wood sawdust, so that the ice doesn't stick, right, when you stack them together. And then there was like a kind of a building where they would store all of this. So he talks about what hard work it was. They would shovel the snow. They would do all the kind of maintenance and groundwork and maintain the trails, etc. He says that he had a great time. He was from New Zealand. He didn't speak a word of French. He tried to make himself understood, but he won them over because when they went to the bar, not the Chalet Cochand bar, because they weren't allowed there, they went to the bar in Sainte-Marguerite. He implemented a New Zealand tradition and bought the first round. Well, as soon as he did that, that was it. He was in. It was all good. So he had a really great time there, but it was hard work. He said he started working at 8 o'clock. They would work like demons, he says, until about 4 o'clock, and then they were off. They would kind of communally go to the pub and get something to drink. So he says it was the toughest work I ever had in my life. As I said, he went on to become a ski instructor. He went back with Clifford to New Zealand, where Clifford was kind of going back and forth between Quebec and New Zealand, obviously taking advantage of winter, summer in both locations, and worked there as well. I'm ending with this last image, just because I find it quite poignant in the sense that when you know the story of Emile and Louis Cochand, who started this entire adventure off together, I'm not actually sure who's on the horse. It may be Louis. It looks like it could be Louis. But there was a bit of a love triangle that ended the marriage. And the love triangle was with the woman who ran the stables. And so here, just to cap things off poetically, you have the image of the man leaving Chalet Cochand on horse. And so unfortunately, their marriage dissolved. He had already, he sold his stake off to his sons. I think he kind of financed them though. So he still had a stake in Chalet Cochand, and that might explain why the waitress said that Madame Cochand, Leah, would still show up, as if she owned the place. But that's kind of the end of that chapter of Chalet Cochand. And for Louis and Morna, they had a similar fate. Unfortunately, their marriage dissolved as well. And she remarried quite happily and passed away before he did. He lived to quite a good age as well. He died not too long ago. I'm not sure what year it was, but it's only maybe 8 years ago or something like that, quite recently. So that's it for me for today's presentation. As I said, it's an ongoing process. This is interviewing people who were there, getting their impressions, learning the stories of people who weren't the kind of celebrities of the place, who weren't the owners, but getting their perspective on what it was like to work at Chalet Cochand. And I definitely want to thank all the people who so far have contributed. I would love to interview more. So if you do know people that have worked there, maybe people from Sainte-Marguerite, I'd love to chat with them as well. A lot of the names are names that I've mentioned. A lot of these people have since passed, including Joseph Cochand, including Charles McLean Cochand, and including Tom Potter, whose mother owned the Alpine Inn, and who my heart breaks because I was supposed to interview him and didn't get a chance to before he passed away. But he did give me insight. He came to see the site, to visit the Alpine Inn again, and so I got a bit of his insight. I also want to thank the Naimark family. He was Victor Naimark was such a big figure in the Laurentians. I think it would be great to learn more about him. One of his grandchildren did publish a book, so you could perhaps pick that up if you're interested. I also want to thank the kind of Laurentians historians, Joe Graham, Michel Allard. They've done such important work that I think needs to be noted. I thank Laurie for her article. Laurie writes articles and profiled the Naimarks, so thank you for that. And I also want to send a special shout out to la Société d'Histoire de Sainte-Marguerite, Provenance et Sainte-Adèle. They have a lot of the Cochand archives. And good news, the mayor of Sainte-Marguerite told me that, and it's public, right? I can say it. Yeah. It's fingers crossed, but he told me, so if he told me, it must be public, that they're going to get their own locaux. They're going to get their own, what do you say? Not offices, their own kind of museum or their own space, to be able to welcome people.
Very small.
Yes.
But the archive would be very worth it.
Yes. So right. So yes, the archives were at one location, and then that was kind of a rental, and the owner needed a space, so they had to move. Right now they're being housed at a private location, so it's not a location where you could welcome people. This location is going to be right next to the church. It's the former bank. They're going to have the vault, so you can imagine now the archives will be protected. And that's great. So congratulations, Michelle, on that. And I would invite you once they open in a few months to.
Exactly, because in our job.
Okay. Space. Okay. 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 So at some point in the next, hopefully, few months, you'll be able to go in. And as I say, they have some Cochand archives there that you can take a look at. Among them will be this, which I think is really cool. I didn't have time to get into it. I'm in PR, as I said, and these are PR missives that were sent out by the Association of Resort Owners. And often in here, they'll talk about Chalet Cochand. They'll talk about all the personalities we talked about the Jarmans and all the things at their store, about Fritz Shannon and the ski instructors. So again, this will be at the archives and you'll be able to consult it. I've also gotten permission from a lot of people that I've interviewed to deposit the interview at the archives, so that oral history will be protected with the Société d'Histoire as well. So all really good news. And it's great to have those interviews with people like Joseph Cochand. I was lucky to meet her just a few months before she passed away. So that's a lot. I've gone on for 90 minutes. I don't know if anybody, I didn't notice any questions online. If anybody does have any questions, or if you want to come chat with me afterwards, I'd be happy to talk to you. If you're interested, there are the postcard collection, or at least part of it is back there. Any questions before we wrap things up? This is called Those Fabulous Skiing Cochand. It was available through Blurb online. He made it available. Now, I'm not sure because he's passed away and I couldn't find it again. So I'm not sure if it's still available. Do you have a copy of this book, Michelle, at the archives? But do you have this book?
No.
Oh, you don't have this book. Okay. Well, if anybody is interested and would be careful with my book, I'd be happy to lend it. But it's very precious because this is really the family historian's perspective of the history of the place. So I hope that you enjoyed today. Again, I'm here if you have any questions. I'd be happy to chat with you. Chloe, I'll leave it to you.
Yes, so I want to say thank you very much to Michelle. That was super interesting. I hope everybody here present at Chalet Bellevue and online enjoyed that. And if you have any further questions or you'd like to speak to Michelle, like she said, you could stay a little bit and chat with her. So thank you so much for participating.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks to everybody online.